The guideline went slack in my glove so suddenly that I checked my reel first, because a line doesn't just lose tension in a flooded tunnel unless you've reached open water or you've made a mistake. My fingers traced it anyway, expecting the familiar pull leading back through the limestone throat behind me. But the nylon drifted like dead grass between my knuckles while my body kept moving forward. That was wrong. I could feel it before I understood it. Pressure thick in my ears, the kind that never quite cleared no matter how carefully I equalized. A faint mineral bitterness seeped through my regulator and coated the back of my tongue. Then the vibration started again, low and steady, not something I heard through the hood, something I felt in my chest strap and tank harness, like a second pulse trying to sync with my heart. My light swung left. There was a wall there, not a turn, not a curve I hadn't noticed, a wall pale and close where open passage had been less than a breath earlier. Silt hovered in front of it, but it wasn't blooming from impact. It was hanging still, each grain suspended in place like the water had forgotten what movement was for. I kicked once, hard, and looked up on instinct. My bubbles were above me, silver and round, not rising, not flattening against stone, just trembling in the beam. Then something pulsed through the water. Not a current, a message. My own exhale broke around my faceplate. Behind me, somewhere past the reach of my light, something touched the back of my tank with the care of a hand reading Braille. I still didn't turn around. What I couldn't stop thinking even then, and was why the people who knew about this place had only ever left fragments, never the full warning. That was 6 days into the job. I took the assignment because it sounded ordinary, and ordinary was what I was good at. My work usually began with somebody insisting a cave had changed, or a tunnel had shifted, or a map was wrong, and it usually ended with me proving the rock hadn't moved at all. People did. Divers got tired, spooked, turned around in poor visibility, trusted memory over line work, then came back to the surface convinced the earth had played a trick on them. Limestone didn't need defending from imagination in Florida. It needed patient verification. When Odessa Morale Thorne first laid the file in front of me, the office smelled like damp paper and old air conditioner coils, and I still had spring water drying salty on my wrists from a morning recon. Odessa Morale Thorne didn't present the reports like a mystery. She presented them like a nuisance. A cluster of divers had logged inconsistencies in mapped passages near Wakula Springs State Park. Nothing catastrophic, nothing official. Just enough repeated remarks to make the Park Service want an outside review before rumors got ahead of policy. Passage tighter than charted. Junction seemed farther east. Line angle different from prior survey. One report simply said not the same tunnel as last season. No one had filed equipment failures. No one had logged narcosis concerns. No one had attached video that proved anything. That alone told me how seriously I was supposed to take it. If divers think they found a real geological change, they bring evidence. And if they think they might have imagined it, they write around it. Odessa slid a laminated system map across the desk and tapped a cluster of blue tracings with a short, clean fingernail. There was a smell of coffee gone cold on her sleeve. She said the same thing I'd already begun thinking. Disorientation, familiar sections misremembered, spring systems breathed, sediment shifted, visibility changed people's confidence. She wanted fresh measurements, line verification, and a clean report stating there was no active hazard beyond the usual ones every cave diver signs up for. I asked if any of the reporting divers had refused to return. She said some had, but that wasn't unusual either. Florida caves attract two kinds of people, those who learn humility and those who learn excuses. At the time, I liked her answer. And what bothered me wasn't the reports. It was the way the margins of the file had been filled. Not formal notes, not incident summaries, fragments, handwritten lines copied from earlier dive logs, then copied again from somewhere else. Same warnings, but never in the same order. Always leave a marker at every junction, even if you think you'll remember the way. Never follow a passage that narrows faster than your light can reach the end. If the water stops moving, turn around. One line had been crossed out and rewritten so many times it was a bruise on the page. Nothing in the packet explained who'd written them first. I asked Odessa if those were local sayings. She gave the kind of smile people use when they don't want to admit they've heard something too often to dismiss it. And she said cave communities collect superstitions the way boats collect salt. It didn't mean the ocean was haunted. It meant people wanted language for the things they couldn't control. That should have closed it for me. It almost did. But I kept turning back to those fragments because they weren't written like myths. They were written like shorthand between professionals, the kind people use when the longer explanation has already failed too many times. I spent the rest of that afternoon with the system map spread across a plastic table, breathing in the rubber smell of dry boxes and old line reels while I compared official charts against unofficial copies. The inconsistencies didn't form a pattern I could call meaningful. A few feet here, a different notation there. But the corrections all drifted in the same direction, deeper into the less traveled branches, as if confidence degraded with depth in a way experience couldn't fix. That's the kind of detail that seems minor until it isn't. I have thought about it every day since. I made my initial plan the way I always did. Baseline descent, confirm line routes, note sediment load, rock integrity, flow behavior, and passage dimensions against prior survey data. No heroics, no chasing rumors. If there was a real explanation, it would survive measurement. If there wasn't, I'd know that too. Before I left, Odessa leaned one shoulder against the doorframe and told me not to waste time entertaining local legends. Her voice stayed dry, but there was a faint click in the ballpoint pen she kept opening and closing against her thigh. She said experienced divers don't always write formal rules because formal rules become liabilities. If you put superstition on a government document, people ask you to defend it. If you keep it in a logbook margin, it stays where it belongs. That was the first answer I got to the wrong question. I wasn't asking why no one had formalized the rules. I should have been asking what kind of place made experienced divers feel safer being incomplete. The first descent felt like exactly what I'd been hired for, which was probably why it got under my skin so badly later. The water at the entrance was cool and familiar, spring-fed and clear enough that my light reached farther than I needed it to. I tasted the usual limestone bitterness through the regulator, felt the small ache of pressure settle in my ears as I descended, and clipped into the main guideline with the comfortable rhythm that comes from doing the same checks 1,000 times without letting them become casual. Everything at the start agreed with the map. The main corridor opened where it should have. The floor dropped in the expected shelf. The side fissure to my right pinched down exactly where the chart indicated impassable restriction. I marked my progress, checked my headings, and moved with the controlled pace that keeps a cave from becoming a race against your own breathing. My lights were good. My gas was good. Visibility was good enough that my exhaled bubbles glittered against the stone overhead in the ordinary way, always moving, always telling me where up still was. Then I reached the first place that felt wrong. If you've spent enough time underground, you learn the difference between a tunnel that's narrow and a tunnel that's becoming narrow. One is geometry. The other feels like intention. This passage shouldn't have changed much across a single season, but my shoulders registered the constriction before my eyes did. The walls seemed to ease inward in a way the chart hadn't prepared me for. Not collapsed, not broken, just closer. My beam slid ahead and found the bend, but it took longer than it should have for the light to touch the next opening. I stopped, held my position, and checked the map slate clipped at my waist. Recorded dimensions said I should have had a little more room. I took measurements, They didn't support the feeling. My instruments stayed boring. Line tension stayed true. Flow was present, steady enough to brush the soft silt on the floor in one direction. I told myself what any competent diver would tell himself. Sediment can make contours look soft. Familiar maps create false certainty. Tight spaces feel tighter when you're focused on them. Still, the water felt heavier there. That's the best word I've found for it. Not denser in any measurable way. Heavier, like each kick had to convince the passage to let me through. The sensation lived in the chest more than the limbs. My harness seemed to carry more weight. My ears wouldn't quite finish equalizing. The faint vibration I would later come to know was already there, but I mistook it for distant flow moving through unseen rock. I proceeded. Every few yards I paused to compare what I saw against the survey line. The major landmarks remained where they belonged, yet the in-between space resisted memory. A little longer, a little tighter, yet a little less certain. When I reached a junction, I left a marker, made the note, and continued. The cave gave me no dramatic event, no failure, no clear contradiction I could bring back to the surface and hold up as proof. Just an accumulation of almosts. That was how it started, not with fear, with professional irritation. On the way out, I noticed another detail I didn't like. The flow along one wall had left a pattern in the silt that reminded me less of current and more of repeated contact, as if something soft had been passing close to the stone often enough to comb the sediment into parallel arcs. My light showed no animal large enough to make that mark. Florida cave systems host life, of course. Blind fish, crustaceans, things that survive in thin niches most people never think about. But these traces were too broad, too regular, and too deep for any small cave life I expected to find there. I took a photograph. Later, reviewing it on the surface with damp neoprene cooling against my skin, the image looked like nothing. A few curved lines in pale silt, no context, no scale, the kind of thing you delete when you're clearing memory cards. At the time, I still thought rock and water explained everything. I know now that the cave had already started answering me and I didn't understand the language. I filed the first dive as inconclusive and requested access to older private maps, not because I believed in shifting tunnels, but because I wanted to catch where memory had infected documentation. Odessa approved that much with obvious relief. No incident meant no escalation, no anomaly meant no press headache. She stood over the table while I logged my notes, and the smell of wet limestone rising from my gear bag, and she said the system always unsettled first-time reviewers. It was large enough to make people feel unmoored. Scale did strange things underground. She meant psychological scale, space, distance, isolation. By then, I was already beginning to suspect the scale problem wasn't in the human mind at all. My second deep run was supposed to settle it. I chose a branch where the prior reports overlapped most cleanly, a route with enough historical survey work behind it that any true inconsistency should have been easy to pin down. I entered before sunrise, when the air above the water still held the night's chill and every metal buckle on my harness felt cold against my fingers. The spring smelled faintly of algae and stone. My first exhale underwater tasted mineral and clean. Nothing in those first minutes suggested I was on my way to the one chamber I still feel in my bones when I'm standing on dry pavement. The route down behaved normally until it didn't. There wasn't a visible transition, no bend I could point to afterward and say, there, that was the threshold. The current simply lessened until I noticed my suspended silt wasn't drifting the way it had been, and then lessened more until the water around me felt held. I stopped finning. That should have let me feel whatever residual flow remained. Instead, I hung in place with a stillness so complete it made my skin crawl inside the suit. In a cave, movement is constant, even if it's slight. Water breathes through systems, it carries your exhalation, it brushes line and loose sediment. Here, nothing touched me except the faint throb in my chest harness. And then I looked up. My bubbles had left the regulator in a silver chain and stopped above me, each one trembling in the beam like it had hit glass. I knew enough physics to know I was seeing something impossible, which is a dangerous sentence for any investigator to think in a flooded cave. Impossible makes people stupid. I forced myself through checks instead. Orientation, depth, gas, light, line, all correct. My ears hurt in a steady, dull way, not sudden, not catastrophic, but like the pressure around me had climbed without changing depth. I swept the ceiling. Limestone, no trapped pocket, no overhang holding the exhale in place, just open water above and bubbles that would not rise. That was when the vibration changed. It had been background until then, a low hum somewhere between sensation and sound. In that chamber it sharpened, not louder, but more organized. I felt it through the sternum first, then in the straps across my shoulders. 3 soft pulses, pause. 3 again. My own heartbeat answered, or seemed to. For a few seconds, the pattern and my pulse matched perfectly, so perfectly that I had the sick, irrational thought that the chamber was listening to my circulation and practicing it. I didn't stay to test that idea. I backed out slowly, one hand on the line, eyes up on those impossible bubbles until the first one twitched and drifted loose. The moment the water moved again, the entire chamber seemed to release me. Flow returned in a single cold slide against my wrists. My bubbles went skittering to the ceiling. The vibration dropped back into the background. I exited without pushing farther. On the surface, pulling the regulator from my mouth, I tasted that limestone bitterness stronger than before, almost metallic, and couldn't fully clear the pressure in my ears no matter how many times I tried. I sat on the tailgate with my hood peeled down and replayed the event the way investigators replay everything, stripping emotion first, building a chain of facts. Water became still. Bubbles stopped rising. Pressure sensation increased without depth change. Vibration pattern matched heartbeat. No instrument recorded an anomaly. I wrote it all down. Then I crossed out the line about my heartbeat and wrote it again more cautiously. Felt synchronized to pulse. Even then I knew how it sounded. I showed Odessa the notes and got exactly the reaction you'd expect from someone responsible for a public site who does not want reality expanding under her feet. She read the page while the smell of sun-warmed neoprene and wet nylon filled the office. Then asked whether trapped gas pockets or visual distortion could have created a false impression. I said no. She asked if stress could have affected my sense of time. I said maybe, but not buoyancy physics. She didn't argue after that. She just set the page down very carefully and told me there were local divers who refused certain branches for reasons they never explained well. And if I wanted folklore to compare against the measurements, she knew someone who talked more than most. That was how Lyle Arnett Kincaid entered it. Looking back, that chamber wasn't the discovery. It was the notification. I met Lyle Arnett Kincaid in the equipment shed behind a maintenance lot where everything smelled like diesel, mildew, and dried lake mud. And he was already there when I arrived, sitting on an overturned crate with his fins beside him and a spool turning slowly between his fingers as if his hands needed line to think. He had the calm look some divers get after too many years underground. Not relaxed exactly, but economized, like he'd long ago learned which motions were worth keeping. Odessa made the introduction in the brief tone of someone putting 2 chemicals in the same room and stepping back. Lyle Arnett Kincaid looked at me, then at the dive notes in my hand, then at the damp mark my gear bag had left on the concrete. The shed fan rattled overhead. Somewhere outside, tree frogs had started up in the heat. He didn't ask what I'd seen first. He asked, "Did it notice you yet?" That was the moment the file margins stopped feeling like folklore. I asked him what he meant. and he shrugged like the answer should have been obvious from the question. The spool clicked softly as it turned. He said most people who got spooked underground came back talking about darkness, or getting turned around, or their own head playing tricks. The people worth listening to came back talking about changes in behavior. Water stopping, passages tightening, touch where nothing had shown itself. Odessa made a quiet, irritated sound at that, but she didn't interrupt. I asked Lyle Arnett Kincaid what he thought was down there. He didn't give me monsters. He gave me territory. He said people make the same mistake with those caves over and over because maps teach them to think in empty space. Tunnel here, chamber there, restriction beyond. Like the whole system is just stone with water inside it. He said it wasn't empty at all. And it was occupied, layered, and old enough that human divers barely registered except as disturbances. Some passages belong to one thing, some depths belong to another. Crossed the wrong boundary and the response changed. I asked him what thing meant. He said, if I could see them clearly, I wouldn't still be alive. It was infuriating, which in hindsight was part of why I trusted him more than I wanted to. People inventing stories love detail. People telling you what frightened them usually don't have enough. He started giving me the rules the way someone recites directions to a dangerous road, not formally, just from memory. If the water stops moving, you've entered a claimed zone. If your bubbles do not rise, you are not where you think you are. Never follow a passage that narrows faster than your light can reach the end. If something touches your gear and you did not see it approach, do not turn around. Always leave a marker at every junction, even if you think you'll remember the way. He said them without emphasis. No theater, no pause for effect. That was worse. I asked why none of that was ever written cleanly in official logs. He gave me the first complete answer I ever got. Because no one can prove it without going far enough to be noticed. Because anything specific enough to sound useful also sounds crazy on paper. Because if you write a full warning, somebody treats it like a challenge and follows it deeper. Fragments at least make careful people cautious. Odessa crossed her arms and asked him if he was trying to help or scare off an investigator. The smell of hot dust from the fan motor drifted down between us. Lyle Arnett Kincaid never looked at her. He kept his eyes on me and said it didn't matter which. The cave only cared whether I knew enough to stop acting like a trespasser with instruments. I asked why he didn't just show me the boundary he refused to cross. He smiled then, but there was no humor in it. He said because once you know where a layer begins, you'll want to see what maintains it. That was exactly right. It was also the wrong temptation. Before I left, Lyle Arnett Kincaid said one more thing that stayed with me longer than any warning. He told me the cave doesn't mind being mapped. It minds being mistaken for dead stone. I went home that evening with limestone still in the back of my throat and rewrote my entire approach. Up to then, I'd been investigating geometry. After Lyle Arnett Kincaid, I started investigating behavior. And that was the first time I understood I wasn't trying to explain a place. I was trying to learn what kind of system would bother responding at all. The next descent was deliberate in a new way. I wasn't there just to confirm dimensions anymore. I was there to test claims. Same gear, same route family, better notes, more markers. I kept my movements clean, my line work exact, and my pace slower than I normally preferred because I needed to catch changes as they happened, not after I surfaced and started translating them into something my dry land brain could tolerate. The water felt ordinary at first, flowing steady enough to tug the loose edge of a line arrow where I'd clipped it. My ears carried that same incomplete pressure from the moment I went under. I told myself it was anticipatory tension and kept going. I reached the section where the stillness had trapped my bubbles on the previous dive and stopped short of entering it. I held position in moving water and watched the boundary ahead. You could not see it. That remained one of the most unnerving features of the whole system. No shimmer, no thermocline, no particulate curtain. Just passage, then different rules. I placed a marker at the last reliable junction and waited. Nothing touched me. I pushed in. The flow thinned around my gloves and vanished. My exhalation stalled above me. Not as dramatically as before, maybe because I was watching for it now, but enough. The first pulse reached my chest harness almost immediately. Low. Measured. Another followed from farther ahead, not through the water this time, but through the limestone to my left. A dull knock I felt in my jaw hinge more than heard. I started backing out. Something brushed the bottom of my tank. Not hard, not enough to spin me, just a careful glancing touch as distinct from rock or line contact as a fingertip across a watch case. Every muscle in my back locked. The human body has reflexes older than training. When something touches you in dark water, you turn. I had the urge before thought. The only reason I didn't was because Lyle Arnett Kincaid's voice arrived intact in my memory. If something touches your gear and you did not see it approach, do not turn around. So I didn't. I kept my hand on the line. I kept my light forward. I backed out one kick at a time, hearing my own breathing get louder inside the mask while the bitterness on my tongue sharpened into something almost chemical. The touch came again, higher this time near the valve, a gentle tap. Then a pause, then a drag across the tank strap as if something were reading the shape of me by contact alone. It knew where my equipment was, that was the new fact. Not random animal contact, not blind collision, precision. I cleared the boundary and the water moved again in one cold stream around my wrists. The vibration faded by degrees. I still didn't turn. I held that discipline until I reached open line and wider corridor, then checked behind me fast enough to stir the silt. Nothing in the beam. No form, no wake, no eyes, just the tunnel, pale and ancient, wearing innocence better than any place underground should have been allowed to. On the surface, I stripped gear with hands that were steadier than I felt. That's another thing people misunderstand about fear in professionals. Even if you're trained, you don't necessarily shake during the event. The body saves that for when shaking no longer matters. The real sign is attention. Mine had become painfully sharp. I could smell the wet rubber of my harness too clearly. I could hear insects in the grass beyond the access point as individual clicks instead of a wall of sound. Even after I dried off, the touch stayed on my tank in memory with the exact shape of it. Odessa listened to my report with a face that kept trying to remain administrative and failing around the eyes. She asked if it could have been line drift. I said no. She asked if any large fauna were known in that branch. I said not that could approach that quietly in still water, locate the tank, and repeat the contact with the same angle. Then she asked whether I had turned around. When I said no, her fingers stopped moving on the notepad. That detail mattered to her more than anything else I'd said. I asked why. She took too long to answer. Finally, she said every diver she'd spoken to who lasted long enough to become worth listening to agreed on one thing, even if they disagreed on everything else. Turning around inside certain sections made the experience worse. No one could explain how. They only agreed on the rule. That was another answer to Loop 1, though I didn't think of it that way yet. The rules survived because the explanations didn't. That night I lay in bed with the room fan pushing warm air over my face, and every time the motor stuttered I felt a matching pulse in my sternum a fraction of a second before the sound reached my ears. I told myself I was anticipating vibration like any diver does after a stressful dive, and it would have comforted me more if I'd been wrong only once. After the first contact, I stopped treating the cave like a location and started treating it like a subject. Investigators get in trouble when they fall in love with a theory, so I tried hard not to do that. Instead, I built a method. Every junction got a marker. Every marker got a notation. I changed materials, colors, and clip styles so I'd know if movement came from current, from another diver, or from something interacting with the object itself. I logged entry time, flow character, vibration onset, pressure shift, and the exact places where my body started feeling watched before my mind could justify the feeling. The work became obsessive because the cave kept rewarding obsession with data. On one dive, a marker I had placed deep on the left side of a fork was gone when I returned 2 days later. Not lost, relocated. It waited at the same junction on the right branch, clipped neatly into a crack where I knew I hadn't put it. No scuff on the line, no sign another diver had passed. The cave had not erased my note. It had corrected it. I wish I could say that was the point where I stopped going back. Instead, I got more rigorous. The water in those branches had a texture to it by then, a pressure that coated the suit and seemed to linger in the joints after I surfaced. The faint mineral bitterness followed me longer each trip. I would pull the regulator out and still taste limestone an hour later through coffee, through gum, through plain bottled water. Contamination wasn't the right medical word for what was happening, but it was the only human one I had. The system wasn't putting something in my bloodstream, it was changing how I interpreted space. Then came the marker that appeared ahead of me before I placed it. I was entering a narrow run I had not yet flagged on that dive. My hands were on the reel and slate. I knew exactly how many markers remained clipped to my harness because I'd counted them at the entrance. My beam passed over a bend and caught reflective plastic farther ahead, already hanging at the next junction where I had intended to put one. For 3 full breaths, I thought I'd lost track of my own work. Then I checked the clip on my chest. My marker was still there. The one ahead of me was mine anyway. Same material, same color, same notch I'd cut into one corner to separate this survey set from everything in storage. It should have been attached to my harness. It was 20 feet ahead, waiting exactly where I would have put it if I'd reached the junction first. The water around me trembled with that low, chest-deep vibration, and for the first time I understood that whatever moved my markers was not just displacing them after the fact. It was predicting me. I did something then that I'm not proud of as an investigator. I tested it emotionally instead of methodically. I left the marker on my harness unclipped and pushed forward because some part of me needed to prove it was coincidence. The passage opened to the junction. My light found the hanging marker. It rotated once in still water, slow as a compass needle. Mine remained clipped to my chest. There are moments when a working model dies so completely you can feel the mental weight of it dropping away, and that was one. No prank, no current, no documentation drift, response. I brought the marker back to the surface and laid it beside its twin on the tailgate, both wet, both cut with the same identifying notch, while cicadas screamed from the trees and the late heat pressed on my skin like another layer of gear. Odessa looked at them for a long time. Her office had no place left for administrative skepticism after that. She asked me if I wanted her to shut the site branches down informally. I should have said yes. Instead, I asked for older incident records, unfiled logs, private notes, anything divers had refused to submit officially. My reasoning felt sound at the time. If the system was responding in patterned ways, then prior encounters might reveal the pattern. I was still building a case, still revising hypotheses, still acting like understanding would restore control. Odessa brought me a storage box that smelled of paper rot and mildew. Inside were loose photocopies, water-stained slates, hand-drawn route sketches, and more fragments. Not full rules, just echoes. Do not trust the wider tunnel if the narrow one felt earned. If it taps you once, leave. If it taps you twice, it already knows your shape. Most of the notes stopped where specifics should have begun, as if each writer had reached the edge of language and decided that was as far as responsibility went. Lyle Arnett Kincaid found me halfway through the box, sitting on concrete with damp paper under my knees and the ache of pressure somehow back in my ears, though I hadn't dived that day. He asked what I'd learned. I told him the cave was moving my markers. He nodded like I'd reported weather, and then he said, "Good. That means it's done treating you like debris." I asked what came next. He said, "That depends on whether it wants you routed or remembered." I can still hear the fan belt in the shed squealing when he said it. By then, the investigation had changed shape without my permission. I was no longer trying to determine whether passages shifted. I was trying to figure out how something underground could map me back. The layer boundary didn't announce itself as depth alone. That would have been easier. People understand vertical thresholds. This was more complicated than that. On the dive where I crossed it for certain, the route actually narrowed first, squeezing me through a run so tight my tanks felt close to the stone. And the scrape of my fin tip against calcite came back through the water as a thin white hiss. My light reached only a short distance ahead. I remembered the rule: never follow a passage that narrows faster than your light can reach the end, and almost turned back because this one was doing exactly that. Then the restriction released all at once. The tunnel widened around me so abruptly it felt constructed, not geologic. 1 second I was in a tight limestone throat tasting chalk and old minerals through the regulator, and the next I was suspended in a chamber broad enough that my beam faded before it found the far wall. The water remained clear, but scale changed the quality of it. My exhale dispersed differently. The vibration through the harness strengthened until it wasn't background anymore. It had rhythm. Multiple rhythms actually layered at different distances, one through the water and one through the stone below me. And that was when the scale of it finally opened. Not one chamber, not one species, not one anomaly. Layers. I saw the first physical evidence in the rock itself. The chamber walls weren't smooth. They were scored with long, shallow grooves at repeating heights, bands of wear that wrapped the limestone like old shorelines. Some were too high, some too low, some clustered around side openings that branched into darkness at precise intervals. Territory marks wasn't the right phrase, but it was close enough for my mind to use while the rest of me caught up. Different depths had been used differently for longer than any map in human hands had existed. My bubbles rose here, but not straight. They drifted sideways in subtle arcs drawn by pressure changes I couldn't feel on my skin. Twice I watched exhalation gather above me, hesitate, and then peel off toward a side cleft instead of the ceiling. The cave wasn't just flooded. It was structured by invisible gradients, pockets, corridors, and boundaries more sophisticated than any recreational diver would ever know enough to name. I placed a marker at the chamber entrance and moved deeper along the right wall. When I looked back less than a minute later, it was gone. No swirl of silt, no flash of motion. Gone. A pulse came through the stone under my left hand, strong enough to blur my focus for half a second. Then another answered from deeper ahead. My chest tightened with the sudden scale of the conversation I was inside. Up to then I had thought of the touches, the marker relocations, the bubble anomalies as local responses, the way one animal might test an intruder. In that chamber, with multiple pulses crossing through water and rock in sequence, I understood I was hearing relayed information. A system. My light caught movement low near the wall, not enough to resolve. Only a pale fold drawing back into a slot in the limestone with a speed that left no wake. No eyes, no outline I could trust. Just the afterimage of something soft enough to vanish into stone and large enough that the opening shouldn't have hidden it so completely. I backed away from that wall and the vibration intensified immediately, as if distance itself carried meaning. There are things your body knows before your training catches up. The chamber had the feeling of a room where introductions were over. Whatever occupied the shallower passages had been sampling me. Whatever governed this depth had different responsibilities, and I withdrew with more care than panic, because panic underwater is just a slower version of giving up. The route back through the restriction felt longer than before. My ears throbbed. The water coating my gloves seemed somehow colder, though the gauge didn't support that. When I cleared the squeeze and re-entered the familiar mapped corridor, the relief that hit me was not safety. It was demotion. I had been in a deeper jurisdiction and been allowed back into a place I understood. That detail seemed minor then, too. I know what it actually was now. On the surface, I told Odessa the geometry change wasn't random. I told her the cave had boundaries not reflected on any chart, and that those boundaries correlated with changes in flow behavior, vibration pattern, and object interaction. She listened without interrupting while the smell of wet canvas and spring mud thickened between us. When I finished, she asked the only sensible question left. How big? I said I didn't know. That was the honest answer. It was also the one that frightened me most. Investigators can work with a hidden mechanism. A hidden scale is different. Scale means your evidence may only be evidence of the part that noticed you, not the whole that contains it. Lyle Arnett Kincaid was less surprised. When I described the widening chamber and the scored walls, he only nodded and said I'd crossed a layer boundary. I asked how many there were. He said enough that nobody who'd seen more than a few ever came back with a complete picture. Then he added that complete pictures weren't given to us by design. That night, sitting alone with gear drying in the humid dark and the taste of minerals still living behind my teeth, I started wondering how many divers had gone below the recorded maps and simply failed to describe what they'd entered in any language the surface would accept. I was finally close to the right question. I still didn't know the worst answer. By the time the system reacted openly, I had become part of the experiment without admitting it to myself. That's the contamination people imagine wrong when they hear the word. They think spore, toxin, infection. What I carried out of the cave wasn't biological, it was calibration. After enough dives, I could feel subtle vibration through dock planks before I heard footsteps. I could tell when a room's air had gone still without checking vents. My own movement had changed too, and I paused before turning corners. I waited when floor resonance felt wrong. On land, those habits looked like distraction. Underground, they kept me alive. The dive that proved coordination started with 3 separate events that would have meant little alone. First, a touch on the tank valve, quick and deliberate. Then a pulse through the stone under my right hand, 3 beats with a gap. Then the passage ahead appearing wider than my map and narrower than my eyes could reconcile, as if distance itself had folded. Individually, I'd seen versions of all of those. Together in order, with less than 10 seconds between them, they formed an obvious chain. Contact, signal, spatial response. The environment wasn't producing anomalies, it was executing a sequence. I stopped fighting that conclusion and began observing it as cleanly as I could. When I held position, the passage remained stable. When I advanced, the side cleft ahead seemed to deepen while the route behind me tightened in ways too subtle to log in real time but unmistakable to the body passing through them. My bubbles rose until I neared the left wall, then flattened and drifted sideways in a sheet. A second touch came, lower this time, almost under the tank where I couldn't possibly twist to see without violating the one rule that had held across every account. Do not turn around. So I didn't. Instead, I changed one variable. I reached to my harness, unclipped a marker, and set it in the water column where it would sink if ignored. It didn't sink. Something intercepted it below my light cone and took it with such smooth speed that the line attached to my glove barely twitched before going slack. I felt the pulse in the limestone half a second later. No randomness remained after that. I retreated and the corridor loosened. I held still and the vibration diminished. I nudged forward and it returned from ahead, behind, and beneath in overlapping patterns. A coordinated response doesn't need intelligence the way humans flatter themselves by defining it. It only needs distributed function. Scouts, relays, redirectors. Whatever lived in those layers had divisions of labor. I knew that before I ever saw enough of them to justify saying so. When I surfaced, the sun was low and coppery on the water, and I had the overpowering sensation that the ground under the access platform carried the same pulse as the chamber walls. Not continuously, not dramatically, just once, faint and deep, through the soles of my boots. I stepped off the platform and it stopped. I didn't mention that to Odessa. Not yet. I did tell her the site needed closure beyond ordinary hazard language. She asked me if I could support that recommendation with reportable evidence. I looked at the moved markers laid out on the table between us, at the damp maps with their impossible corrections, at my own notes detailing bubbles that refused buoyancy and touch with no visible source, and I heard myself say no. Not in a way the state would accept. Her jaw tightened. The room smelled like rain beginning somewhere outside, electrical and wet. She said that was the problem with places like this. They don't become manageable just because they're dangerous. They become ungovernable because the proof required to regulate them is the same proof that destroys the people gathering it. And that was as close as Odessa ever came to saying she believed me. Lyle Arnett Kincaid came closer in his own way. I found him at dusk, gearing up near the water with the humid evening pressing sweat out of the trees and insects ticking in the reeds. His tanks were already set, his lights checked. He moved with the ceremony of someone preparing for something he had decided on long before that night. I asked where he was going. He said, "Lower." The answer made the back of my neck go cold despite the heat. I told him going lower without a formal team plan was reckless. He almost laughed. Said formal plans were for places that recognized human priorities. I asked whether he was trying to prove something to me. "No," he said, "to them." Then he held up his primary guideline, ran the knife across it and cut it clean, and the severed end curled in the humid air like something alive. I took a step toward him and the dockboard under my boot gave back a faint, impossible pulse. Lyle Arnett Kincaid heard the intake of my breath and nodded as if I'd just confirmed a suspicion he wanted confirmed. He said, "Lines tell the upper layers how badly we need to leave." Below a certain point, he claimed, a tether is just another demand the system resents. If you go down insisting on return, it roots you like debris. If you go down unattached, sometimes it shows you what it preserves. I told him that sounded like faith, not evidence. He clipped the cut spool to his harness anyway. The water lapped softly against the limestone edge, carrying that bitter mineral smell up into the night air. He said faith had nothing to do with it, and he'd just stopped confusing survival with understanding. Then he descended without a tether. His light dwindled under the black surface, white at first, then green, then gone behind a curtain of depth and reflected dusk. I waited for the panic response any sane diver should have had. A plume, a turn, a scramble back up. None came. The water settled. Frogs called from the grass. The dock held the day's heat under my boots while something deeper than current moved once beneath it. I never saw Lyle Arnett Kincaid surface from that entry. That doesn't mean he died. That's the most honest sentence I can give you. By then, the main action of the investigation had become obvious. I wasn't collecting evidence to write a report anymore. I was deciding whether to follow a man who might have surrendered himself to a layered ecosystem because he believed surrender was the only way to see it whole. I waited until morning. That was the last moment I could have walked away and remained merely troubled by what I knew. The final dive began with every rational argument against it already exhausted. I told Odessa where I was going and what route I intended to try, though both of us knew route meant less than it used to. She didn't try to stop me. Maybe she knew I was past stopping. Maybe she had been there herself in some smaller way, standing at the edge of knowledge that ought to be refused and realizing refusal wouldn't restore ignorance. Her face was gray with lack of sleep. The office smelled like wet canvas and printer toner. She asked one thing only. "If it guides you," she said, "will you know the difference from getting lost?" I said I hoped so. That answer embarrasses me now. I entered on reduced expectations and heightened discipline. No fantasy of rescue, no fantasy of conquest. I was there to observe and get out if getting out remained available. The water took me in with the same cold mineral taste, the same pressure that never quite equalized, the same low vibration waiting farther in the stone like machinery too old for names. I passed the still chamber, the contact zone, the first widened layer boundary, each one registered now as an address in a system of jurisdictions. My body recognized them before my slate did. That was part of the contamination. I didn't need the map as much anymore because the cave had taught itself into my nerves. Deeper than before, and the passage choice ceased to feel like choice. That's hard to explain without sounding mystical, and I don't mean it that way. I don't mean a voice called me, I mean every response narrowed probability. A pulse to the left, still water ahead, sideways drift above, a touch on the tank from behind that halted the turn I was about to make, redirection through consequence. Any system can do that if it has enough sensors and enough time. The lower chamber opened beneath me like an architecture built out of absence. My light found columns of limestone dropping into dark, shelves cut with openings at repeating intervals and movement between them so coordinated that the water seemed striped with intention. I never saw a whole organism clearly. What I saw were functions, pale, flexible lengths withdrawing into cracks exactly one depth band above the floor. Broad membranous folds undulating once to alter local flow, then flattening against stone until they vanished. Clusters of translucent bodies no larger than my forearm pulsing against the wall in staggered rhythm. Each pulse relayed through the rock as a tactile knock that another cluster answered farther off. Blind, yes. Pressure sensitive, absolutely. A network built out of bodies and territory. And the territories were strict. That was the revelation that unlocked everything else. The upper passages were not random hazard zones. They were margins, scouting bands, places where small responders sampled disturbances and tested shapes. The middle layers were routing space where contact, marker movement, and current distortion guided intrusions without spending more energy than necessary. Deeper still, the system broadened into chambers designed by use, not by intention in the human sense, where different species hierarchies occupied fixed vertical and horizontal claims and communicated through vibration patterns in both water and stone. No single creature governed it. The ecosystem did. The cave wasn't alive as one thing. It was inhabited so completely by many things that human maps had mistaken occupation for geology. My moved markers were there, not scattered, grouped. I found 3 clipped into a calcite seam at shoulder height along the entry lip of the chamber, each one from a different dive, each one positioned with unnatural neatness. A 4th hung lower, older, its plastic clouded with age and silt, not mine at all. Human-made, decades old, maybe more. Then another beyond it. Then the rounded glint of line arrows lodged in stone seams where no current should have arranged them. Divers had been here before official records admitted. The system had collected traces of them the way I had tried to collect measurements. That answered Loop 2 as much as anything ever will. How deep did it extend and how many had entered? Deeper than our charts, farther than the named cave branches, likely into connected aquifer arteries no recreational map has ever captured. And many. Enough to leave generations of markers. Enough for fragmented warnings to survive without formal testimony. Enough that the ecosystem had long practiced with our species. Then I saw what it did with new information. A small pale body, almost eel-like except for the soft fan of tissue near its head. It emerged from a slot below the marker seam, carrying one of my tags in a grip so delicate it barely disturbed the silt. It pressed the marker against the stone, released it, and pulsed once. The knock traveled through the chamber wall. Farther below, the broad folds I had taken for random movement adjusted in sequence, redirecting a ribbon of suspended particulate away from one passage and toward another. A route changed because an object had been placed. The system wasn't only storing evidence of us, it was incorporating that evidence into its responses. Humans were mapped the same way I mapped the cave. That was the worst truth in it, and it came all at once. The touches had not been attacks. They were measurements. Tank height, equipment profile, reaction speed. The bubble stalls were not traps. And they were controlled environments where upward expectation failed and panic could be observed. The moved markers were not harassment. They were queries. If the object changed location, would I still choose the same turn? If a marker appeared ahead of my intention, would I continue? Even the passages that seemed to tighten or widen were not necessarily changing stone at all. The system used gradients, stillness, redirected flow, and bodies positioned just beyond sight to make certain routes feel passable or hostile according to what it needed from the disturbance. It did not trap divers. It studied and redirected them. I hovered there with my light shaking in spite of every effort to keep it steady, feeling pulses travel through water and wall in coordinated layers. It then understood that the cave system I had come to investigate as a set of inaccurate maps was actually a structured ecosystem old enough to have protocols for intrusion. Not instinct alone. Procedure. A distributed territorial intelligence without central mind or human language, but with memory, categorization, and response. And it already knew me. That was the cost of staying long enough to understand. The vibration reaching my harness had changed over the last dives because it was changing in relation to me. Not generic disturbance, recognized pattern. My body had started anticipating pulses on land because my nervous system had been trained by repeated exposure to their signaling environment. Whether that was adaptation on my end, targeted calibration on theirs, or some uglier overlap between the two, I still can't tell you. What I can tell you is that when I held still in that lower chamber, the nearest cluster on the wall pulsed in my heartbeat pattern again, only faster this time, matching not my resting pulse but the exact elevated rhythm I was carrying in that moment. Then a second cluster answered from below in the same pattern, then a third. I was no longer just inside the system's awareness, I had become a known signal. Panic finally tried to become useful and couldn't. There was nothing to fight, no single predator to fend off, no obvious pursuit. Just a coordinated landscape of living territories treating my presence as data. I backed away carefully from the marker seam and the chamber responded at once. Not violently, efficiently. The broad folds near the lower opening shifted. A side passage to my right lost its stillness and drew a slow current outward. Above me, exhaled bubbles that had begun to flatten regained their upward drift. Redirection. Exit presented, guided, not lost. That was the last upgrade to my understanding, and it made the opening days of the job look childishly naive. I had believed caves were places where things happened. This was a place that processed events. Our species had mistaken the intelligence of coordination for the passivity of rock because it didn't look enough like us to flatter us into recognition. I left when it let me. I need to be clear about that. I was not chased out. I was not heroically escaping a closing mouth of stone. I followed the route of least resistance because the environment arranged one, and every time I hesitated or tested a wrong branch, the familiar sequence returned. Touch, pulse, spatial refusal, take this way. Not that one. On the ascent through the upper layers, I passed one last object fixed into a seam at the edge of a narrowing run. Not a marker. A section of cut guideline frayed at one end, clipped with the neatness of storage rather than accident. Lyle Arnett Kincaid's line, or one like it. I didn't reach for it. I surfaced for the last time in late afternoon with the heat of Florida pressing down on the water and dragonflies skimming the shallows like the world had remained simple while I was gone. My regulator came out tasting of stone and copper. My ears should have equalized in the open air. They didn't. The pressure stayed, not painful, permanent. A low fullness, a low. It was as if some part of depth had lodged inside the head and declined to leave with the rest of the water. Odessa was waiting at the access point. I told her enough to close the branches in every unofficial way available, and maybe she has. I told her the main action cleanly. I went down. I found evidence of prior unrecorded descents. I observed a layered aquatic ecosystem coordinating responses by vibration and pressure gradients. I exited under what I can only describe as directed allowance. I did not find a body. I did not find proof Lyle Arnett Kincaid was dead. That is still true. She asked if I would write it formally. The damp air smelled of mud and warm reeds. Somewhere under the dock, something pulsed once against the pilings, too faint for anyone not already taught to feel it. I looked at Odessa and understood why the warnings had always been fragmented. A complete account either becomes a dare, a joke, or evidence that obligates someone else to go prove it. Fragments are the only ethical form of testimony when the full truth functions like an invitation. So no, I didn't write the formal report they wanted. I wrote the closure recommendation: geological instability, survey inconsistency, unpredictable subsurface conditions, all true, none sufficient. I left Florida after that, or tried to. Distance doesn't help the way people think it does. The change wasn't tied to one access point anymore. It lived in perception. In grocery stores, I notice the hum of refrigeration units through the soles of my shoes before I hear them. In elevators, I know when the cable tension shifts. In hotels, I wake before dawn if the plumbing in the walls stops moving for too long. I never sit in a room without finding the line of easiest exit, and I never fully trust stillness in enclosed spaces, not in water, not in air. Most of all, I check for vibration when no one else does. That is how knowledge marked me. Not with nightmares, with habits, with calibration, with the quiet certainty that the world contains organized territories humans mistake for emptiness because we haven't evolved the senses to read what is announcing itself beneath us. The unresolved part is the part I can't test without going back. Sometimes, standing on concrete over parking garages or bridge approaches or subway platforms nowhere near Florida, I feel the same low pulse I first mistook for distant flow in limestone. One beat. Pause. Too close together. Not random. Irresponsive. If I change my stance, it changes. If I still my breathing, it waits. Once in a building 11 states away, I felt a pattern in the floor that matched the rhythm I had carried into the lower chamber on my final dive, and a second later the pipes in the wall clicked an answer. Maybe that's memory looking for structure. Maybe contamination only means my nervous system learned a language it can't stop hearing. Or maybe the system did what all good mapping systems do when they encountered something worth tracking. It extended the boundary. I haven't been back underground since, but sometimes the room goes still and I wait to see whether the next pulse is under my feet or answering me.